Robin Alexander is a Fellow of Wolfson College at the University of Cambridge and Professor of Education Emeritus at the University of Warwick. He is Fellow of the British Academy and Academy of Social Sciences. He's past President of the British Association for International and Comparative Education, as well as being former Director of the Cambridge Primary Review and Chair of the Cambridge Primary Review Trust. The book we're examining today is called A Dialogic Teaching Companion, published in 2020, and it represents a culmination of over 25 years of his research into oracy. The dialogic framework described in this book was tried in a very large piece of research to gauge its effectiveness. The research findings were conclusive. The engagement and learning of disadvantaged students was improved dramatically.
Robin, thank you very much indeed for joining the NAPE YouTube site this afternoon. We're most grateful you could spend your time talking about one of your books, and I know you've published a great many, but this is of particular interest because it links so nicely with the series of videos I've been producing about oracy. But this is called A Dialogic Teaching Companion. Now, as you know, I've recently interviewed Neil Mercer regarding the importance of oracy in primary schools, and I know you've written several books and research papers on this subject. However, would you say your arguments about oracy rests in the primary curriculum slightly differently from Neil's arguments about the use of oracy?
Yes, we start with the term oracy. This term was invented in 1965 or coined in 1965 by Andrew Wilkinson in an attempt to give talk parity with literacy and numeracy. That's why the assy at the end, numeracy, literacy, oracy. And it was specifically about the place of talk in the curriculum. And that's what most interests Neil Mercer. Neil and I have worked together. Together, Neil and I and Jim Rose leaned as heavily as we could on Michael Gove and his colleagues about the failure to give due weight to oracy in the current national curriculum. And so I know his work well and have a very high regard for it. But I know that at the moment his efforts are, and he said this quite explicitly, directed towards giving oracy a central place in the curriculum. Now, I would support that objective. However, my work on talk, which goes back quite a long time, is both about oracy and about more than oracy. It's, for a start, it's about more than the pupil. The focus of oracy tends to be on the kind of talk that the pupil should develop. I focus equally on the teacher, which is why I call it dialogic teaching, because of course, whereas reading and writing can be undertaken by the pupil independently of the teacher, talk is uniquely dependent upon other people, because we have to have someone to converse with.
Yeah.
And in classrooms, it's uniquely dependent upon the teacher, or particularly dependent upon the teacher, as well as other pupils, obviously. So the teacher's role in oracy is absolutely critical, because depending upon the opportunities that the teacher provides, the prompts that the teacher gives, the degree to which the teacher encourages and allows and enables certain kinds of talk, or inhibits certain kinds of talk, or prevents certain kinds of talk, the extent to which the teacher builds on what the pupil has said, has a direct impact on the quality of the pupil's talk. So all my work on dialogic teaching has given, while it agrees absolutely with Neil and others that in the end it's the pupil's talk that we're chiefly concerned with, I argue that unless we give considerable attention to the kind of talk that the teacher uses in order to enable the pupil's talk, then we will not allow the pupil's talk to achieve its maximum potential. So what I do is frame what is essentially a complete pedagogy. So it's about more than the pupils talk, and therefore it is also about more than oracy, and certainly about more than the English curriculum. It's about talk across the curriculum. It's about talk in all aspects of teaching and learning. But it's also about more aspects of teaching than talk alone. And again, most people who work in the field of talk tend to concentrate on talk and talk alone. I argue that unless you also give attention to very practical matters like how you organize the space of classrooms, how you handle time, how you handle resources, the kind of climate which you establish, is it supportive? Does it encourage pupils, including those who are shyest and most reticent, or have most difficulty, or those who have speech and language difficulties? Unless you attend to all these things as well, then again, you will not allow talk to achieve this kind of potential which it needs and deserves. And the other point I'd make, again, in pursuit of this argument that dialogic teaching is about oracy, but much more than oracy, is that it's also an approach to how we see knowledge and human relations. The Cambridge Primary Review, with which you, Mike, are familiar, and I hope a fair number of your members are.
Absolutely.
And it's good to be talking to NAPE, because although I've worked in all phases of education, primary education was where I started as a teacher, and that's the phase of education in which I've done most work and which I've campaigned most assiduously. Now, with the Cambridge Primary Review, one of the aims of education that we proposed was one which I think captures in a nutshell my argument that dialogic teaching is about more than oracy. We say, this is the aim called enacting dialogue, and I'm going to read. To help pupils grasp that learning is an interactive process. That's fine. That's the teaching part of it. And that understanding builds through joint activity between teacher and pupil and among pupils in collaboration. Now that, your members will recognize, is a direct reference to the work of people like Vygotsky, who say that, we learn most effectively when we're working with others.
Yes.
And thereby to develop pupils' increasing sense of responsibility for what and how they learn. Now, what we're saying here is that dialogue is about handing responsibility and ownership to pupils for the learning process. Now, that tends not to feature in many discussions of oracy. And then it goes on to help pupils recognize that knowledge is not only transmitted in the way that people like Michael Gove thinks it should be, but also negotiated and recreated. Yeah. And that each of us in the end makes our own sense out of the meeting that is of knowledge that's both personal and collective. And finally, we say to advance a pedagogy in which dialogue is central, dialogue between ourselves and others, between personal and collective knowledge, between present and past, between different ways of making sense. So in other words, it's not just a kind of practice in the classroom, it's a frame of mind. It's a viewpoint on education as a whole. And central to it is this notion that it stands in direct opposition to those ministers whom I had to deal with when the national curriculum was being reviewed, who said, well, what the national curriculum is about is listing the knowledge that teachers should hand to pupils. The notion that education is a process of simple transmission. No, it's not. It's about discussion, it's about negotiation, it's about the meeting of different ways of thinking, and so on. And so dialogic teaching captures all of that, as well as the nitty-gritty of how talk is best managed in classrooms.
That's absolutely great. I mean, I go back to my own teacher training days in 1970, and we were played a tape. And on this tape, in a mining village, was a teacher talking to the pupils. And it was almost, as you say, a negotiation of knowledge and understandings. And anybody who came in was amazed by the amount of understanding those children from quite poor backgrounds were able to talk knowledgeably about quite a few subjects. And that was 1970. And I'm so sad that we haven't learned from those many, many examples which exist. Anyway, I digress. Now,
No, that's not that actually isn't a digression. It's utterly relevant, Mike.
anyway, thinking about your book, which has been favourably received by the academic community, and there's a picture up there. There we go. There of the front cover. What did you set out to do in this particular publication?
Well, it was a summation of about 30 years' work. I mean, as you know, I've not just worked on classroom talk, and in that sense, I'm perhaps a little unusual because most of the people in the field tend to be focused on talk throughout their academic careers, the academics who are working in the field. I've worked in a lot of other areas, a lot of other countries, true, as well. But this is a summation of this aspect of my work over the last 25, 30 years. And the reason why I wrote it now was I reckoned that my dialogic teaching approach, dialogic teaching framework, had got to such a point when it needed to be totally revised. And also the wider research evidence has come on at such a pace in the last few years that I needed to capture the best of it and set it down. But more particularly, the spur was a project which I co-directed for the Education Endowment Foundation. Now, as you know, this is concerned with finding practical ways to tackle social and educational disadvantage.
Yeah.
And I was approached by Kevin Collins, the then CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation back in 2013-14. And he knew my work on dialogic teaching. In fact, I'd taken him to classrooms to look at it when he was directing the National Literacy and National Library project. He wanted me to subject this to a randomized controlled trial. Now, you know how these work. It's a very rigorous process. It's conducted totally independently. So I wouldn't be marking my own homework, evaluating my own work.
Yes.
Conducted by another university. And they have a control group and an experimental group, and they give them the same treatment, and they see whether then they test them, and they see which group comes on furthest. And so we set up this project, a 3-year project, which ran from 2014 to 17. And the focus of attention, and this is what we trained our teachers in the project in Leeds, Bradford and Birmingham to use, was my dialogic teaching framework. So they received training in that, and they worked within that framework for 2 terms. And then another university came along, and their team tested the children that we were working with and the children that we weren't working with in the control group. And the pupils in our group, in the experimental group, the intervention group, and there were 5,000 overall, so it was a very big study.
Gosh, yes.
By the end of just an intervention of just 20 weeks, they were 2 months ahead in standardized tests of English, maths, and science.
Good Lord.
That was a remarkable result. And whereas up to that point, I, of course, had plenty of research evidence that what I was talking about would make a difference because it was from other research studies. And there were some evaluations of my early work in Barking and Dagenham and North Yorkshire. What I didn't have was a big national study to support it. So this was the first time, really, that this approach had been very rigorously evaluated. And on that basis, I decided, well, the time has come to put all this into a book, which would both update my own material on dialogic teaching, but also apply the lessons of this big randomized control trial. And that's what's contained in the book.
Ooh, yes, I've noticed that one of the chapters actually talks about teachers' professional development within that framework. So it's very, very useful in that way. And I'll certainly be putting up the chapters to show the different chapters on the screen so that viewers can appreciate how extensively this whole area of oracy has been covered, and that research is extraordinary over such a short period of time. To get that sort of progress is fantastic. Anyway, in the prologue, thinking about that book for a moment, you say that dialogic teaching helps teachers teach effectively. But in a nutshell, why should dialogic teaching help teachers teach effectively?
Well, the evidence from that randomized controlled trial, the education outcome, is that it does do just that. Because if they raise standards to that extent, after just 20 weeks, then it clearly works. It helps them to teach effectively in as far as it exploits what research evidence shows about what makes for effective teaching, and high quality, cognitively engaging, empowering talk is one of the key things. But it works for other reasons. It helps them to teach teachers effectively for other reasons. It's good at getting children to participate, engage. It helps motivation. It helps confidence. Without engagement, motivation, confidence, without pupils feeling that they can talk without being constantly judged or ridiculed or slapped down, then there is no learning, really. So it's very important at establishing the kind of climate that all good teachers want to establish anyway, whether or not they're interested in dialogic teaching. But more particularly, it's effective because it enables teachers to get inside pupils' heads. If the only kind of talk, or the main kind of talk that you have in your classroom, is the traditional pattern of asking an open question, who can tell me X? Hands go up. A child is picked. It's either the child who is doing that, or it's the child who is not doing that and is therefore picked on. But anyway, it's not a particularly rigorous system of getting children to talk. If you can phrase questions in a different kind of way, in a way which gets children to think, and you can encourage a full participation across the whole classroom, and if, having received an answer, you do something with it, you don't just receive it and say, good, fantastic, brilliant, and then move on to another child or another question. But you say, now, why did you think that? But are you sure? And what do others think about this? You know, that you do something with the answer. Then you are getting inside, you're getting inside the child's head. Once you can get inside the child's head, then, of course, you gain access to their understanding and especially their misunderstanding. So you can help them to make progress. That's why there is quite a considerable overlap between dialogic teaching and assessment for learning. Not assessment at the end of Key Stage 2.
No,
constant ongoing assessment, which every good teacher does to establish where they are, where the child is, what might be done next. And whereas, of course, Ofsted tends to regard written work as the only real work, I would argue that talk is equally real work, and therefore there should be lots of it. But it has this, just as by assessing children's written work, you can identify where they have problems. So by encouraging and listening to them talk and probing their talking, you can get inside their thinking processes and help them all the more. So that's the burden of that particular argument about helping teachers teach more effectively.
Yes, it's a superb approach because it's organic. It's as the children learn, take them from where they are to where they need to get to within a culture, if you like, of listening to all the children. And the psychological and social benefits you've touched upon are so crucial to get children to understand that there is learning going on and they understand the point of learning, which I think is great. If I can move on, chapter 2 talks about talk for learning, which we've just talked about, which is great. But looking on the downside, the danger of teachers not allowing students sufficient space to, and I quote, sufficiently develop the narrative explanatory and questioning powers necessary to demonstrate what they know and understand. I think in a way we've sort of covered that. The downside, the negative is, I suppose, that they're not going to learn. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a pattern of teaching which the Americans called recitation. Your colleagues may have heard the term, but may not, because it is an American term.
Yeah.
But what is meant by it is what we might call traditional interaction. Closed question,
Yeah.
to which there's just one answer.
Yeah.
And the pupil has to spot what that correct answer is, give it back. The teacher gives praise or condemnation, or a non-committal response, moves on to the next question and the next child. And such interactions tend to be rather brief, not sustained, and the teachers tend to move rapidly from one child to another. And above all, it's the teacher who asks all the questions. There's a wonderful book by James Dillon on classroom questions, in which he has statistics on this, and it really is quite alarming. The relatively small proportion of classroom questions which are asked by children themselves. Now, teachers of early years would beg to differ, because of course it is part of the early years tradition that children do get encouraged to ask questions. But as they grow older, the opportunities for children, but for pupils and students in secondary schools to ask questions are progressively reduced. And it's the teachers who do ask all the questions. And in traditional teaching, the questions they ask are not necessarily questions that encourage thinking, but they're questions that look for correct answers. Transmission. Martin Nystrand, a great American academic working in the field of literacy and children's writing, but also classroom talk, said that the bottom line is that whatever pattern of talk you use in a classroom, it must encourage pupils to think and to think for themselves, rather than to repeat someone else's thinking. And if you think about it, that's not only a precondition for effective learning, it's actually also a precondition for citizenship in a democratic society. And that's another respect in which I would argue that dialogic teaching is about much more than oracy narrowly conceived. It's also about citizenship, truth, and indeed some of my later writing has been about post-truth and fake news, and what we can do in classrooms through talk to counter all this that's come from the political trends of recent years, but also from social media.
Yes, that's so true. And I'll look up those references so I can put them on the screen, the couple of books you've mentioned. That's really helpful. Let's return to Michael Gove, shall we? Because in 2012, he used the term idle chatter.
Well, actually, it wasn't Michael Gove. It was one of his underlings.
Oh, it's one of his underlings.
You can probably guess who, but I won't name it.
No, yes. And of course, that was the National Curriculum Review. And I think you've said in your book that it certainly sealed the place of oracy in schools and affected its use in schools. And I've just picked up recently that one of the Ofsted hubs is now talking about silent lessons in schools. So why is it that the government is so determined to exert this sort of almost iron fist-like control in the classroom and continue to ignore the key importance of oracy in education?
You've interestingly and correctly used the right word there, control. It is all about control. I think there are many reasons. One of the reasons is that ministers who tend not to be trained teachers themselves do what so many people do, which is to fall back on their own education. And so they think about the way they were taught, and they say, well, it got me into Oxford or wherever, so it must be good. That's to ignore an awful lot of other considerations. So they fall back on their own experience. But the idle chatter thing was, I think, it was astonishing because it took place after a seminar which Michael Gove had organized, much to his credit, at my request, at which I talked about the British evidence, and then by video link an American colleague spoke about the international evidence, and then we had a debate about it, and the minister present then said, well, yes, I understand your arguments, but I don't want to encourage idle chatter in class. And furthermore, I think this emphasis on talk is detracting from literacy. So there's a sense in which he just simply didn't get it. The evidence suggests that the kind of talk talk is never idle, but the kind of talk that we're discussing is certainly not idle. It's very focused, it's very rigorous, and it gets children to think. It's challenging, and it works, as that project demonstrated. But also that claim that it would detract or distract from literacy is again evidence that he just didn't get it, because of course, as Halliday and all kinds of other people have argued, and as teachers know very well, oracy and literacy don't exist in separate compartments. They have a familial relationship, and good literacy teaching makes a considerable use of the spoken word. And after all, what are phonics? That's you cannot separate them in that way. So to argue that it would distract from literacy, well, yes, to ignore oracy would detract from literacy. But so there's the experience, there's the, if you like, the stranglehold of a traditional view of what teaching is all about. The teacher does the talking, the teacher has the knowledge, the teacher has the expertise. It's the teacher's job to hand it on to the pupils. So that very traditional transmission view, and all the talk that the pupils need to do is to give answers to questions that teachers pose. So the notion of discussion and pupils asking questions themselves, and pupils independently generating hypotheses and ideas, that just doesn't figure. But I think also there's a fear there, and certainly we can see it lying behind in the older Victorian elementary schools. Speak when you're spoken to. Children must learn to read and write and know their place, but not talk, because talk is volatile. Talk can open up children's opportunities to challenge what others, including teachers, are saying. And there is a sense in which you open up talk in classroom. There's a sense in which it actually generates risks. It generates risks of two kinds. Firstly, if you have a more democratic relationship in a classroom, whereby children themselves ask lots of questions of each other and of the teacher, then your own knowledge as a teacher of the subject that you're teaching or the area that you're working within is tested to an extent that it doesn't if you hold all the cards and you ask all the questions, because you will only ask, in the traditional context, you will only ask questions to which you already know the answer. That way you remain totally secure.
In control, yeah.
And if a child asks a question, well, that's not permitted. But if the environment is one in which children have as much right to ask questions as you, a teacher, do, then of course your own understanding is exposed. Now, as an ex-primary teacher, teaching across the curriculum as we all do, I know that there's one ploy that one always uses, which is if a child asks a question, you say, I don't know, but let's find out, shall we? We all do that. And it sounds like a cop-out, but it's not. It's actually it's a good gesture to say, actually, I don't know. I'm not omniscient. I'm not a fount of all knowledge. Together, let's find out. And it's something that I think that I can recall doing that in the 1960s when I first started teaching.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think is much an approach which is much more familiar in primary schools than secondary schools. But there is that fear of exposure of the limits of one's knowledge. And the other fear is, of course, a loss of control, a loss of discipline. Because if you open up the talk, you open up the discussion, it becomes much more free-ranging, then it's much more difficult to to ensure that the behavior of pupils goes down preordained channels as many teachers would wish it to. So it's risky. But on the other hand, by increasing pupils' engagement and motivation and interest, that's counterbalanced by the fact that pupils enjoy what they're doing that much more and are less likely to be distracted, and therefore it is less risky.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's interesting you mentioned the Victorian perspective, because of course it was payment by results. And what are we doing nowadays? We're looking at school SATs results. And so in a sense, there is that shadow still there. Over 100, over 150 odd years. So it's extraordinary how it's continued. So,
well, Mike, it's not just payment by results. It's also the notion of the 3 R's. We still use that phrase.
Yes, that's right.
And oracy is excluded from it.
It is. Yeah. It's yes. If not divorced from literacy, which I think
and
is
divorce from literacy.
Anyway, Chapter 8 is termed professional development, and given your expertise in developing teacher skills in oracy, what do you think are the key elements? Now, this is a biggie, or strategies that teachers should plan in implementing oracy in their class teaching?
Well, that chapter, if I'm right, the one to which you referred is the professional development chapter, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. The last 2 chapters of the book, the first 6 are, exploring the field and bringing everyone up to date with the research and discussing some of the key issues in it. And then in chapter 7, I set out the current version of the Dialogic Teaching Framework, which has a number of elements: repertoires, principles, indicators, and so on. And it's a holistic framework. Every part of it matters. And then in the final chapter, I build on the Education Endowment Foundation project's approach to professional development, which I devised, and offer a framework for professional development which schools might want to use or adapt. And really, it needs to be looked at as a whole, because it is a holistic approach.
I see.
But and it does require that the teachers and schools wanting to develop their work in this field actually engage with the Dialogic Teaching Framework as it's set out in Chapter 7.
Right.
But there are a number of points of leverage, I think, which I can mention in response to your question.
Yes, please. Yeah.
The first is mentoring. The notion that it's good for teachers to work together on this. Now, in the Education Endowment Foundation project, the teachers in each school had peer mentors. They weren't senior management, they weren't heads. They were other teachers who were given time to observe and work with the teachers who were particularly interested in developing their capacities to teach dialogically. And it's a very powerful tool. The notion that it should be peer mentoring is important, because if it's top-down mentoring, the risk is that it will look inspectorial.
Yes, yeah, I agree.
And the teachers being mentored will feel uneasy, uncomfortable, they feel they're being judged, they won't want to take risks. Now, you need to feel free to take risks. You need to feel free to have an open conversation with your mentor. So mentoring is one of the key successful elements of this. The second is the use of video. Now, in the EF project, and all schools have video equipment now, the teachers made regular use of video of their own teaching for establishing baselines. So it was the thing progressed over those 2 terms in 2-week phases, 2-week stages. And the idea was that you made a video at the end of one phase or the beginning of the next. and then you worked on particular aspects of your teaching over the next fortnight, and then did another video, and your mentor viewed video extracts with you, and you discussed how things had gone, and what were the strengths, what were the emerging strengths, what were the areas on which further work might be useful, and so on.
Yeah.
A video is known to be a very, very powerful tool in professional development.
Yeah.
So I would say that although there are a number of elements in the approach to professional development that you'll find in chapter 8, those two are particularly potent. A further point I'd make is that, and you can see the combination of video and mentoring is about
definitely
a constant conversation with someone else, but using evidence. So the evidence is what you've captured on video.
Yeah.
And the teacher owns the video and can select what is looked at. So it's not like having someone sitting in the classroom watching you and then making notes, like the old teaching practice tutor or an Ofsted inspector. You can be alone. You set up your video camera, and the book talks about where to position it and really practical questions about the use of video. And then you pick out extracts and you you have a discussion with your mentor about these. This is perfectly possible within the normal framework of a school's work. The important point about all this is that it doesn't require you to change the curriculum. It's not about adding something to the curriculum. It's simply about teaching in a way which raises the profile of talk across the curriculum as a whole. So no one can say, but we don't have time for this. We do. We're doing it already. We're doing the whole curriculum already. At least I hope we're doing the whole curriculum, not neglecting the arts. But that's another story.
Another story there.
Yeah, we're doing it all already. We're talking already, but we're just going to be talking in a different way. And the pupils are going to be doing much more of it. But we are going to be talking in a way which encourages them to do much more of it. So you don't. The argument that there's no time doesn't cut any ice.
No.
But there are shortcuts. I mean, I do argue very strongly that the total package needs to be understood as just that. But nevertheless, there is now very hard research evidence, mainly from video analysis, from a project that Neil Mercer was involved with, from our own project, and another one, that there's a critical point of leverage in the interactive process, and it's what linguists call the third turn. Now, you imagine talk is about turn taking. You asked me to say something, I'm replying. So yours was the first turn, mine is the second turn.
Yeah.
If you come back and challenge what I've said or respond to what I've said, what you say will be the third turn. So in a classroom, in traditional teaching, the first turn is the question from the teacher. The second is the pupil's answer. The third is the teacher's response to that answer. Now, we've established from our video analysis that what seemed to make the biggest difference, two things made a real difference to those pupil test scores and to the quality of pupil motivation engagement. The first was getting the climate right. So establishing ground rules for talk, making sure that the layout of the classroom is really conducive to talk. We found the horseshoe arrangement better than tables pushed together, and certainly better than desks in rows.
Yes.
Thinking about the way you handle time, space, and so on. All these aspects are gone into in the book. And above all, making the climate supportive. I mean, there are a set of principles. So getting the climate right. The second is doing something with what pupils say. Now, there are a lot of material out there in the marketplace on teachers questioning, how to ask good questions. Hardly anything on pupils' responses and what you might do with them. That's where we need to shift the center of gravity.
Yes, definitely.
To what the children are saying, to thinking as teachers, thinking about what they say, analyze what they say, probing what they say, getting other children to respond to what they say, and above all, building on what they say.
Yeah.
And that's the third turn. And all the evidence from our video analysis, from Neil's video analysis, from the analysis of Sarah Michaels and Cathy O'Connor, two leading American researchers, is that the maximum point of leverage comes when teachers or other pupils do something with what pupils themselves say. First of all, the climate and the pattern of talk encourages pupils to talk. It asks different kinds of questions. It sets up different kinds of scenarios for talk. It encourages small group discussion and all the rest. But then, having got the pupils to talk, it doesn't just leave it there.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why we encourage extended exchanges, not one-word answers anymore.
No.
It was an insight which I gained from comparative research in a number of other countries, including Russia, of all places. Now, that was in better times in Russia, but also France and India, the United States, in Denmark and Finland. And I found much more commonly than here in England, a tendency for teachers to use extended patterns of talk with given pupils. Now, when I talk to pupils in this country about it, they say, but we must, in a given lesson, we want every child to participate. But if you think about that, the ratio of minutes to numbers of pupils, that means that in a given lesson, if a child is to participate, it's only going to be for a few seconds.
Yeah.
Brief exchanges don't achieve anything except responses, yes, no responses to closed questions. But if, having asked a question, you receive an answer and you probe it and you build on it, then that time is very well spent. Even if in a given lesson, not all the pupils participate, because what you use as your unit of analysis for participation is, say, a day of the lesson. Say, today, Wednesday, every child is going to have a chance to participate, but it's not going to participate in the sense of giving a one-word answer. It's in the sense of having an extended exchange with me or with another pupil.
Almost like a conversation. A
conversation, yes. Yeah. And there are all kinds of prompts in the framework for the ways in which you can get children to extend their talk. Can you say more about that? I'm reading from it. What do you mean by that? Can you give an example? So let me see if I've got what you're saying. Are you saying this? And then paraphrase it back to them. And they say, no, it's not that. What I was really saying was this. Or who can repeat what X has just said? Can you put it into your own words? Or if there's partner talk, paired talk, what did the other one say? What do they mean by that? And then the probing. Why do you think that? What's your evidence? How did you arrive at that conclusion? I hope that does it always work like that? Your colleagues, members of NAPE, and I'm an honorary member of NAPE, so it's my organisation as well. Will feel encouraged to look at that, not for the purpose of sales, but because I can't do justice to it in this conversation.
No, of course you can't. No,
it's a fairly elaborate framework, but I think you'll find it makes sense. Certainly, those teachers in Leeds, Bradford, and Birmingham found it made sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that, Robin. Can we just have a quick look at your website? If I just share the screen, that would be good. Okay. Can you see that? All right.
I can see that. Yes.
Good, excellent. Now, and if you look at the top line, it says about research publications, and there's the Dialogic Teaching there. So there's a web page devoted to that, and
if you look at the top, that's the framework. It doesn't take you to the framework, but it tells you how to access it. And then there's a bibliography. Can you just scroll down on the right hand side a bit to see all the menu? That's it.
Yeah.
Then there's a section about the Education Endowment Foundation project. And then there's an order form for the book. And then there's something about other resources.
Ah, yes. If you click on that, you can actually see the other teaching resources and there's the trial which you talked about, and bibliography.
You have to click on. There's a further click at the bottom.
That one there. Oh yes. Yeah. Oh gosh. And that's recent. That's 2021.
That I keep that updated. There are lots of links in there.
Yes, I was just thinking the links are extremely useful.
It's massive material.
Yeah, that's fantastic, because of course we have quite a lot of students who are NAPE members as well. So if they're doing any writing to do with this area, that will be extremely useful for them. That's great. And of course you've got the Cambridge Primary Review, which you are nationally well known for in terms of leading.
If you click to just scroll down a bit.
Yes.
Click on Trust, Cambridge Primary Review Trust.
Yep. We've got lots of links there. Let's see if I can.
Second.
That one there.
Yes. That's it. That's the Cambridge Primary Review Trust website.
Yes. Yes. And there's the address up there. Yeah.
The trust followed the review. The review ended in 2010 with a final report, which was rather sabotaged by the Labour government. But then we set up a trust with the help of Pearson, which built on its work, involved many, many schools, and that ran through to a triumphant final conference in 2016. And then we wound the trust up in 2017 on a triumphant note. But the Chartered College of Teaching has kindly taken over the website, and although it's not live anymore, it's still kept usable. So there's a massive array of resources there that teachers can access. All the material which we generated, both from research and by working with schools, various projects of one kind or another, reports, briefings, press releases, blogs, and that is kept usable by the Chartered College of Teaching.
Yeah,
so you can access that, or you can access that directly, or you can access it via my website.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for all of that, and Robin, thank you very much indeed for you.